Well, good afternoon, good morning. Thank you very much for joining us again. My name is Dre. I'm a customer success engineer here at Moveworks. I'll be our host for today's session. You'll notice a quick rebrand or a renaming of the sessions to the AI Agent Workshop. I hope that sort of communicates the renewed focus on using agentic within Creator Studio. So I think that you'll find, at least for the next month or so, maybe longer even, that most of the use cases we're discussing are going to be agentic based use cases, meaning that we're leveraging Plugin Studio in some way. Um, so with that heads up, let's go ahead and get started, and I can show you some of the sessions that are coming up. So today, of course, we're discussing Salesforce risk monitoring. Again, this is an agentic use case. We'll talk about it here a bit in a moment. But in coming weeks, catch up with us for the Slack channel catch up use case. This is going to be a generative use case that reads Slack channel posts and sort of creates a summary for you, so that way you don't have to reread through the whole channel to catch up to things. And then on the November 13th, we will be discussing Datadog incident summarization, sort of a similar kind of use case, taking the output of some more complex thing. So in one case, it's a Slack channel. In another case, it's a Datadog incident, and then reading that, summarizing it, and then returning some useful information to the end user using generative AI. Very exciting use cases. But again, today, let's go ahead and just talk about Salesforce risk monitoring. We can go ahead and get started on that. We will have a Q&A session at the end of this call, so if you do have any questions, please add them to the Q&A section of the Zoom chat, or add them to the chat, and we will get to them in due time. So Salesforce risk monitoring is a use case that we use internally. This is something we actually quite enjoy within our own bot. So when I'm giving a demo today, it's going to be all within our internal bot, because we actually do use this use case. Now, Salesforce allows for the ability to include what are called risks on accounts. So risk is an account object, or it's its own thing that sort of falls under an account object. So the way that we're going to make this work is by essentially querying for the account with the Salesforce data API, and then using the return to then create sort of response, highlighting the risks on the account. So this is a Salesforce risk monitoring by account use case. The overall user experience we want to build is something like this. So the bot, or a user, will come to the bot and ask, what are the risks for some company? In this case, I have the fill in Acme. In our case, we're going to say, once we ask that, what are the risks for Acme, we then need to trigger our plugin use case. And so the first step is that the agentic slot resolver will identify the account name as Acme. What do I mean by that? I mean that the bot will pull out the word Acme here as the slot, or the variable that we're going to then leverage to make our initial API call. Once that step takes place, the bot then is also going to go ahead and look through and understand the action that it needs to take. And so Manifest Generator will construct the overall flow of how things will take place. The bot's going to give sort of I understand your query. I'm making the action call now message. So that's what this message here is. I'm currently retrieving the risk information for Acme. Once it's actually making that query, the first step is going to be using the Salesforce connector that is leveraged for our action to make the API call to accounts. So again, our action here is to make the API call to get account data. And then step 4, it'll actually get the return, format the response, and then you can see the response below. At a high level, this is sort of architecture, process diagram, however you want to phrase that. But we have a user comes to the bot and asks a question that then is triggering a plugin. So recap to Rithika's session from last week or the week before. A plugin has a handful of subcomponents, but this is the thing that we're building ultimately today, is this plugin that looks up Salesforce risks. So the actual plugin is composed of triggering criteria and a compound action. The triggering criteria here are the configurations that we make that help the bot understand when to actually present this as the option for resolution for the end user. And then the compound action is you can think of that as like the meat of the action. So what do I mean by that? Compound action will be constructed of, in today's use case, only one action, as well as the connector that's associated with that action. However, a compound action might have many actions strung together. So I just want to sort of make sure that this framework makes sense. We can definitely talk about this more during the Q&A portion of the call. But today, our compound action is comprised of one action. So fairly simple action and compound action. So all of this, it goes together to be bundled into a plugin, which is then going to make this action where we are contacting Salesforce, getting back the account object, getting the risks associated with the account object, and then presenting those risks back to the end user. So let's go ahead and take a look at the construction of this use case. So the first thing we needed to do is build an action, remember. So we're going to go ahead and go to actions. And in this case, we've already built this out, but I just want to walk through it to sort of show you what it looks like. The first thing we have here is a get API call to our internal Salesforce instance, and we're using the data query API. This is already using the Salesforce prod connector, so we don't have to, redefine that connector. But if you don't already have a connector for Salesforce, then certainly create that first before coming to your action. It just makes things a little bit easier to handle and manage. In our query parameters, we have our query, which is defined by the key Q. You can see here we're saying select ID, name, and then we have sort of a sub query here where we're asking for information from the risks object associated with the account. And we're going to say from account where name is, and then our account name. And we've set a limit here to limit is one. We only really want one response, but you can imagine a scenario maybe where you have multiple responses, maybe you have multiple accounts under the same organization or customer or something along those lines, and you want to get risk objects for each of those different accounts, then you would just change that limit. But fundamentally, this use case would actually be built the same way because the generative AI could pick up on that and sort of present multiple options and help you sort of walk through. Beauty of agentic. That we have no body configurations. We do have a header configuration here. This is just for formatting. So content type is application JSON. And then here you can see our input variables. We're going to use this test account. This is the name of the account. You can think of this as like Acme in our prior screenshots. But our internal testing account here is ops test account. So this is the account name we're going to test with when we're building this action. So let's go ahead and test and just make sure that we're getting a response back from Salesforce with the data that we're expecting to see. So you can see a 200 response. That means success. And we can go through the records here. We can see that this account has a name ops test account, has this ID, and then has this risk associated with it. So it looks like we only have one risk. We can see total size is one here. Again, this doesn't have to be just one risk. You could get back many risks if you have many associated with an account. And again, the bot should be able to handle it. But as long as we have things configured here this way, so that way we get back this response with the data we expect, then we can move on to building our compound action. So let's move over to the compound action. Again, we're going to go to compound actions and go look for the compound action we have built for this use case. So we have Salesforce risks by account. What this is going to do, again, is going to sort of string together all of the actions that we need to make this plugin work. Now, for this specific plugin, we only need one action. So that one action is defined here under steps as contacting this action here, action name, Salesforce get risks by account. That's the one that we have configured over here. We're going to pass in account name as an input argument. And then these are the configurations that just say, how does the bot, how do we influence the bot when it is generating messaging to let you know that you are basically you should wait because it's working on the action or that it's been completed. So in this case, our on pending message is searching Salesforce for, and then the account name. In this case, maybe the ops test account, and then found info for, again, the account name. Once we get that back, we actually want to return something that's a little bit more complex than normal. So the first thing we want to do is return this account URL, which we're rendering here using this render functionality. So the template for the URL is always going to be more or less the same. We're going to have the base URL for our Salesforce instance. We're going to then drill down into the account object, and then we're going to pass the account ID for the object. This actually gets us to the risk in our case, but definitely something that you can play with when building out your own specific use case. You may deal with risks slightly differently. Maybe it's not called risk underscore underscore C. That's just the version that we're using. Finally, is this risks object that we're trying to return, and we're going to map this to a couple of different things. So we have a URL for the risk. So up here was the account URL, but this is the risk URL. You can kind of see how that is working here, where we pass in this item ID for the risk. We pass in the risk reason, and we map the JSON response from the API call to Salesforce to these keys. So in this case, we're saying item dot risk reason underscore C is the risk reason. We can come back here and sort of match that up. We can go to item and then risk reason underscore C and see if that was actually in our response here. Yes, is other. So item here is referring to the specific record, and then risk reason is the key we're calling. So you'll notice item.id, item.risk reason, item.status. That kind of format is what I would expect to see here. So all of these will correspond to some value in our JSON return. And then that's it. I mean, so that is the configuration of the compound action. So again, you do need to define input fields. In this case, there's just a random example value that's been thrown in. But this is going to be the description of the actual compound action, and it will take in, again, the value that we're passing in through this action. And then finally is the plugin. So let's go ahead and go to plugins, and we can take a look at the plugin that's built for this use case. So the Salesforce Risks by Account plugin. You'll notice that the configurations really were bulked up in the compound actions. We have this use case name is Salesforce Risk by Account. We have a short description, and then we have informational message to the user during execution. All of this is just sort of the UX of how things look to the end user, the dialogue that's presented to them. But where things become important for the plugin are the triggering criteria. So again, looking back at our diagram here, we've built the action. The connector was already there, so we just have an action. We then package that into a compound action using the workflow logic that we defined in our configurations for the compound action. And then the plugin is going to take that compound action, associate it with some triggering criteria, and then that is the plugin. So if we go back to our plugin configurations, you can see the triggering criteria we have here. These are some example user utterances. These aren't like the exact user utterance that we expect users to be asking questions to get this plugin to be triggered, but they're just some examples of what we might expect users to do. So you can imagine a scenario where you're saying, just top risks for account XYZ. That's not specifically written out here, but the bot should be able to understand that this is the most likely response, the most likely resource that would actually solve the user's question. So once we have triggering criteria here, if you're familiar with queries paths, then this will look fairly familiar, really not a lot different. But again, we're associating this with a compound action instead of a specific queries or paths use case. And then finally, we will launch. In this case, we're just going to launch to myself and then a few other internal folks, but we will leave this alone. And that's the plugin. So now we can go ahead and just take a look at what that looks like in action. Let me copy the name. Ops test account. What are the risks for ops test account? And I expect this to trigger the plugin to execute the compound action, and then to in turn execute our one action, which is to actually look up that detail. So you can see I'm currently gathering info for the risks for ops test account. Process is ongoing. I'll update once I have more details. So again, just kind of giving you a bit of insight that the process is taking place. The bot is looking up the data. Be patient, it's coming. So let's see. We expect to get this data back, relatively quickly. Let's see where we go. And there we go. So now we've gotten the response. It's fully formatted. In this case, we only have one risk, so it's only going to respond with the number one here with our risk details. So you can see this is a test risk. Risk reason is other. Status is resolved. We have some recommended actions. We have the ability to click on the risk and view it. We also have the ability to view the test account directly. So this is what we've configured. So this is, I mean, this is the use case we've described. You could imagine building this with a sort of proactive use case using an event API call. So certainly using, and especially in this case, because it's such a simple use case, agentic isn't the only way to do this. But for a proactive use case where the user comes to the bot and asks a question, agentic definitely makes this easier to build versus the sort of same version using a queries use case, which would work just as well, but is maybe a little bit less flexible. All right, and with that, let's go ahead and finish up content. I'll finish sort of the lecture part of this, and then we can move on to the Q&A section. Okay. So really quickly, some follow-up resources I wanted to share are the Creative Studio Developer Certification course. Really, really excellent resource for users who are trying to get onboarded to using Creative Studio. You can navigate to this using our Moveworks Academy. You can find it there, then take the course, highly recommended again. Guided training modules, videos about how to set up specific use cases. There actually are, I believe, if I remember correctly, a set of 3 or 4 use cases that you'll go through just to get onboarded and learn the platform. And then at the end, there is a multiple choice exam that can prefer you a certification that you can share on LinkedIn. Kind of a nice perk for doing the certification course. Finally are our documentation and developer community. Documentation you can think of as your reference material for all things Moveworks, be that Creator Studio, Moveworks Setup, Copilot in general. I mean, there's all sorts of details there. So if you have a question about Moveworks skills, features, functionalities, example use cases, you can find those in the tutorials and guides section on our community portal or our documentation portal. So again, just very much recommend going to that resource if you have any questions as like a first place to go. You should be able to find really any answer to your questions there. If you do need further help, or if you just want to have some discussions with other customers, internal folks, engineers, developers, things like that, go to our developer community. Really also a lovely resource. You can use this again to ask questions to other customers of Moveworks, people who have maybe rolled out similar functionalities or features. You can ask about implementation strategies, communications that you might want to send out in conjunction with feature rollouts. Tons of great information in our community portal. And if it's not there, then create a post and we can, follow up and answer your questions very quickly. So I highly recommend going there as well. All right. With that, I will go ahead and stop sharing my screen, but we are at the Q&A portion of the call. So if you do have any questions, please post them in the chat and I will get to them as quickly as possible. Okay. If there are no more questions, I'll go ahead and end the call. But thank you very much for joining us today. If you didn't get a chance to join us live, then I will create a community post. So navigate to our community as usual, go to the Creator Studio section of the forum, and you can find a post with the same title as this use case. I'll follow up on there. So if you have any questions, we can chat there. And then finally, if you do have any other questions or are just excited to come to the next webinars, then please join us next time. We'll make sure to go into any questions that you have during the Q&A portion. So thank you very much for joining and have a great rest of your week.